Horror movies and ghost stories are a staple of Hollywood film magic. Creatures that torment the living, return from the dead, or generally just make life miserable for all of us. But Hollywood is also a place where the scares go beyond the realm of filmmaking and sometimes find their way into the real world. Maybe it's the trauma of losing the allure and trappings of fame and the adoration of the masses that make ghostly encounters so common there. Or perhaps there's something more sinister that makes Hollywood a prime spot for things like ghosts and curses. If tragedy can trigger a haunting, then Hollywood has more than its share of that. And tonight we're going to take a look into what happens when the applause sign goes off and the afterlife beckons. So lights, camera, hauntings. Because this is extremely strange. The Pantages Theater is said to have three main spirits that haunt the location, with one being Alexander Pantages, a Greek-American vaudeville-era film producer who founded it. Pantages was accused of sexually assaulting a 17-year-old aspiring actress, a crime he was eventually acquitted of upon appeal. But because of the growing costs of attorney's fees, he was forced to sell to Pantages to make those payments. It's believed that because of his deep emotional attachment to his prize theater, his restless spirit still roams the main floor of the building, with disembodied footsteps often heard there. Another ghost is said to be that of a young female patron who died in the theater mezzanine because of an undisclosed illness. It's said she remains within the theater and is sometimes heard singing. It seems she holds an eternal regret for never having the opportunity to display her own talent on stage. A third spirit is said to be that of none other than reclusive millionaire Howard Hughes, who purchased the theater in 1949. A devotee of the arts, he also had an office there where, to this day, his apparition is still seen from time to time. Cold spots are often felt there, and his ghost has been spotted watching rehearsals as he did when he was alive. A younger-looking Hughes, dressed in a suit, is sometimes seen walking around a corner and then through a wall that was once the original doorway to his office. In 1942, 15 years after motion picture talkies had been introduced to Hollywood, John Hampton opened the Silent Movie Theater, which featured his own private collection of silent-era films, as well as an extensive restoration and re-showing of others in an attempt to honor the fading genre. Hampton personally restored some films using toxic chemicals to help preserve the old prints, an undertaking that would eventually prove fatal to him. By the late 1970s, he announced he had contracted cancer from excessive chemical exposure and ultimately died in 1990. Lawrence Austin reopened the theater in 1991 and endured his own tragic situation when he became the target of a murder plot, conceived by his companion and theater projectionist James Van Sickle, who was deeply in debt and stood to gain financially from Austin's death. Austin was shot and killed on January 17th of 1997 in the theater lobby by 19-year-old hired gunman Christian Rodriguez during a screening of a comedy short. The murder was staged to look like a robbery to cover up the actual intent, with the gunman firing off rounds as he escaped through the crowded lobby. Rodriguez and Van Sickle eventually were convicted of their roles in the plot and both sentenced to life in prison. The theater is said to be haunted by the two former owners, Hampton, who haunts the upstairs lounge, which was actually his and his wife Dorothy's former apartment, and Austin, who was often seen in the main lobby by startled employees. A subsequent owner, Charlie Lustman, claims before he bought the theater and reopened it on Halloween night in 1999, he was riding by on his bicycle to get lunch when he was spoken to by the full-bodied apparition of John Hampton. This convinced him to raise the $1 million needed to restore the cinema through investors and wealthy friends. The venue, now known as Avalon, opened as the Hollywood Playhouse in 1927. In 1942, it became the El Capitan and set a record for the longest-running variety review in the history of legitimate theater, Ken Murray's Blackouts. During the 1950s and 60s, it served as a backdrop for many TV specials and variety shows like The Lawrence Welk Show. Today, it is a lavish nightclub still used for television specials, as well as movie premiere gatherings, a filming location, and a venue for top recording artists. It's said that a ghostly jazz pianist still tickles the keys after hours in a small club room upstairs. The smell of old-timey perfume still lingers throughout the club, and a dapper man in a tuxedo has been seen roaming the theater for decades. A couple dressed in 1930s attire have been seen sipping cocktails in their private box, and a ghost known as Harry, a former electrician from the Blackouts era, enjoys tying cable in knots on the catwalk, stealing tools, and generally causing mischief. The eerie sounds of a sobbing girl in a locked stall in the main lobby ladies' lounge has been heard by scores of women, and some other patrons will complain about talking in the balcony during a show, even when the area is closed and empty. Cold spots are also felt in that balcony, and employees report hearing a woman's blood-curdling scream from somewhere in the theater. Legend has it that a chorus girl broke up with her technician boyfriend on the backstage stairs just before she went on to perform. Moments later, the despondent boyfriend threw himself off the catwalk onto the stage, where he died right in front of his former paramour. It's thought that her remorseful spirit is responsible for those screams. During the 1940s and 1950s, the hip place to be in Hollywood was Ciro's on the Sunset Strip. Some of the giants of showbiz like Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis, Jonathan Winters, and Lucille Ball would perform there. But like other Hollywood entertainment establishments back in those days, ownership maintained close ties with the mob. It's been said that, just like in the movies, the wise guys would bring you in for a nice meal, some expensive wine, and then take you to the basement to whack you. Between the 1920s, 1940s, and 1950s, mobster Mickey Cohen ran a brothel right next to Ciro's. Besides demanding a cut of the club's profits, he set up his headquarters in an office upstairs. Reopened by Sammy and Mitzi Shore in the 1970s as the Comedy Club, some of the claims there include a cult sensation that permeates the performance room that's so severe that comics doing a set could see their own breath on a warm evening. Employees would constantly get calls at the busiest times on the club intercom from extension 31, a line that didn't exist. All they could hear on the other end was labored and raspy breathing. Some of the waitresses report odd occurrences in the second floor's belly room. One of them reported opening up the room, lighting candles, arranging tables, and leaving. 5 minutes later, she'd return to look through a glass partition to find the candles out, the lights off, and the door locked. When she returned with the key, the door would be open and the room set up perfectly again. Another night, a security guard made his rounds in a large room which had formerly been Ciro's main room. As he started to lock up for the night, he froze in his tracks as he watched a chair on one end of the stage slide across to the other side, a total of 20 feet. It seems he had no luck with chairs apparently, as one night after closing he went to the back of the empty stage to turn off a light. When he turned back to the stage mere seconds later, he saw 10 chairs had been piled up on it, no more than 10 feet away from where he stood. He claimed to hear no sound while this was happening. It's also been said that two very angry ghosts haunt the club. One is a former mob hitman named Gus, who met his own end at the hands of the very people who hired him. His spirit is more the disruptive and malevolent type. Another is a female spirit and a former employee of Mickey Cohen, who haunts the original downstairs lounge, where she performed many illegal abortions for showgirls, prostitutes, and girlfriends of mobsters. She is assumed to be restless because, despite her belief she was helping many other women in distress, she was nonetheless arrested and publicly humiliated. Perhaps the best story involves the late comedian Sam Kinison. Sam was playing the original room one night while Blake Clark, who worked and also performed at the club, was closing up the main room. Clark heard a murmur of voices in the room that grew louder during Kinison's act. Both he and Blake heard the voices begin to chant, "It's him, it's him." Just then the lights began to flicker and the sound system got very wonky, prompting Kinison to dare the ghosts to show themselves, which resulted in all the lights shutting off. When another performer, Joey Gaynor, and Blake were both in the main stage area, Joey decided to challenge the spirits to show themselves against the advice of Blake. They both watched an ashtray slowly rise from a table in front of them and launch itself at Joey's head, who fortunately ducked out of the way, with the ashtray smashing against the wall behind them. The same duo and another staff member had heard a low guttural growl coming from the basement at 3 a.m. one morning. Blake and the staff member gathered themselves and went down to investigate. The padlock gate in front of the basement was bending out, like something was pushing, trying to get out. The gate suddenly snapped back into place, and to their horror, they saw a 7-foot black form suddenly standing in front of the gate. Blake and the other individual turned and ran back up the stairs as fast as they could. When Blake and Gaynor went down to see if it was still there, they indeed saw it again, in a corner of the room, morphing into a dark mass that resembled a man with no face. Without warning, it flashed by them in a split second, and once again they beat a hasty retreat. There are other mob types who are believed to remain there, but their presence is assumed to generally protect the establishment. However, to this day, employees and visitors to the Comedy Store still report unexplained supernatural activity within the club. Erected in 1923 by Los Angeles Times publisher Harry Chandler as a $21,000 billboard for his upscale Hollywoodland real estate development, the iconic Hollywood sign is a globally recognized symbol of the motion picture industry in Los Angeles. Each letter of the massive sign is 30 feet wide and 50 feet tall, and although it was originally intended to last just a year and a half, the sign has remained in the Hollywood Hills for more than 80 years. But for many Hollywood aspirants, the sign also represents the sordid and tragic side of the entertainment industry. This was especially true for 1930s actress Peg Entwistle. Peg, like many others hoping to hit the big time, moved to Los Angeles in 1932 with the dream of becoming a star in the new talkies that were all the rage. Sadly, her dreams never came to fruition as she waited for the big break that never came. While staying at her uncle's house on Beechwood Drive, which was literally in the shadow of the Hollywood sign, a despondent Peg Entwistle decided one September night to use a workman's ladder to scale to the top of the H and throw herself off to her death. She was just 24 years old. The next day, a female hiker found Peg's body, along with a single shoe, a jacket, a purse, and a suicide note which read, "I am afraid, I am a coward. I am sorry for everything. If I had done this a long time ago, it would have saved a lot of pain. P.E." In a tragic twist of irony, A letter arrived the day after her death, offering Entwistle the lead role in a play at the Beverly Hills Playhouse. Even more grotesquely, she was given the part of a woman driven to commit suicide. Today, locals claim that Entwistle's ghost still remains at the site of her untimely death. Visitors report seeing her residual spirit repeat her fatal leap from the famous landmark, and park rangers and hikers have described seeing a young blonde woman in period clothing wandering the area who simply vanishes when she is approached. Wander in room 920. overdosed on a cocktail of cocaine, heroin, and a third drug known as a speedball. He was just 33 years old. But there are claims that Belushi hasn't left the building. Comedian turned U.S. Senator Al Franken claimed to have stayed at the chateau a week after his friend's death and slept in the same bungalow. He awoke late one night from a restless sleep to see the ghostly figure of Belushi standing over him. "John," he called out, trying to focus on the figure. But by the time he put his glasses on for a better look, Belushi had disappeared. A family staying in Bungalow 3 in 1999 claimed their 2-year-old son was laughing and seemingly talking to himself on several occasions. When the parents asked him who he was talking with, he just replied, "The funny man." Later, when the boy's mom held up a photo of Belushi to the boy, he blurted out, "The funny man." A few years back, when my son and I flew into LA to do a TV thing, we got to our hotel, turned on the TV, and were met with a news flash that a severed head had been found at the base of the Hollywood sign. Welcome to the City of Angels, boys. Now, trying to establish what the most haunted place in Hollywood is, that's going to meet with some debate. But, as you could see, hotels rank pretty high on that list. And a visit we paid to the Hollywood